everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're watching and when. Welcome to White Line Fever Live. I've really got to do these rugby league podcasts every week, but life gets in the way and they're a bit irregular, which frustrates me. Well, it looks like we may have lost our guest, which isn't good. I'm hoping he calls back in. But our guest, I'll tell you a little bit about him. His name is Tom Mather. He's an English fellow living in, actually he just told me, just south of Wollongong. And he's a very prolific author. He actually did John Doherty's biography, which John Doherty, as you might know, if you follow anything I do, is one of my favourite players. He must have done 10 books if you look on Amazon, Tom Mather. And his most recent book is, it's called Rugby League is Born. And in the book, he, the blurb, I haven't read it yet, the blurb suggests that the legend or the myth that we all accept about the birth of rugby league, that it was about broken time, about players not getting time off work to go to games, and players not being able to afford to play unless they were paid for the time they missed work, that this is not necessarily the case. That this isn't really the reason rugby league was born, and that it was a far more complex story. Welcome back, Tom.
Nice to be with you, Steve.
Yes, great to have you back. We lost you for a little bit there. Before we talk about your new book, which sounds fascinating, Rugby League is Born, can you set up for the viewers and listeners a bit about how you came to write John Doherty's biography and how you came to write all these books? How many books have you published now?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I'll be pushing up towards 30.
Wow.
But with regard to John Doherty, when John was the coach at Wigan, my son, Barry John Mather, was just breaking into the first team. And it was John who actually converted him from a second row forward to a centre. And his career took off from there. And it was John that brought him over to Perth Western Reds when he was the assistant coach there. So I've been coming to Australia from around about 1994, really. And during that time, I used to come over and we'd stay with John. And I thought, this is a guy who's got a fascinating story. And so he very kindly agreed to let me have a look at all the scrapbooks that his mum had kept. And I was able to piece together what I think was a wonderful career for an Australian who did it in Australia, but he did massive things in England, very badly treated by Wigan, when he did the double and got sacked.
Yeah. I mean, John Doherty was my favourite player as a kid. I went to the Steelers' first training session and got his autograph at the end of 1981. So a very special player to me. But you've written a lot of rugby league history books too about the Rorke's Drift Test and
I wrote a book way back in '93 with Mike Latham, which was the first book I wrote, which was called The Rugby League Myth. And it was that book that was instrumental in this latest book because I got an itch that I couldn't scratch. And the itch was that things were not as the officials at the Rugby League would have us believe with regard to how the game was formed. And other things took over, and I eventually came out living here. And I've been writing books. I wrote a series of books about the tours down to Australia by the England Rugby League between the wars. And it's just sort of escalated from there, really. I'm just running out of ideas of what to write about next, basically.
Well, we don't want you to give away the sort of punchline of your latest book, Rugby League is Born, but can you tell us a bit about the premise of it and how what we've all been taught, that rugby league was a kind of working class revolution against Twickenham, who wouldn't let players be reimbursed for time off through injury or travelling to matches. How that perhaps wasn't necessarily the case?
It wasn't really the case at all. It's a lot more complex and complicated than that. And I know Professor Tony Collins, who I know well, Tony Collins wrote for university when he was doing his PhD, and we got this psychological, sociological tome about how the poor working class North was, it was inevitable that broken time payments would lead to the breakaway. It was far more complicated than that. The problem started way back in 1892, because in 1892, the senior clubs in Lancashire, but particularly in Yorkshire, were facing massive problems, and those problems were coming on two fronts. Firstly, there was the turnstiles. If the Yorkshire clubs were playing in the Yorkshire Cup tie, or they were playing in a local derby, yeah, they got a massive crowd. But the mundane week-to-week bread and butter games were being viewed as meaningless, and they were staying away in ever-increasing numbers. And that spelled financial disaster for the clubs. But the other problem came from the rival code of soccer. By the end of the 1891-92 season, the Football League was successfully running two divisions, 16 clubs in each division, year on year. So it was always something had to be done. And in 1892, 10 of the senior clubs in Yorkshire met in secret and decided they were going to form themselves into an alliance. That in itself wouldn't have caused a problem for the authorities. What did cause the problem was the fact that they wanted to form an alliance league, which they wanted to run and they wanted to control. The Yorkshire authorities, and for that matter, Twickenham and the English Rugby Union, were never going to allow that to happen. And so the was refused by the authorities, and that led to conflicts. Now in Lancashire, the problem didn't arise because the Lancashire authorities were quite happy to have league rugby, and they quite happily set up a first, second and third division. The difference was the Lancashire authorities would control all three divisions. In Yorkshire, the 10 clubs, they were quite adamant they wanted to control it. And matters escalated and there were interminable meetings. And the clubs and the authorities. And in the end, in July of 1892, the 10 senior clubs in Yorkshire resigned from the Yorkshire County Rugby Union. And that brought the authorities to the table. And eventually what transpired was an alliance league, which was, first of all, was going to be controlled by a subcommittee of the Yorkshire Rugby Union. But that subcommittee was to be made up of one member from each of the 10 senior clubs in membership. And that was how they got, in brackets, control of the game. The problem was that when it came to the bylaws, bylaw 28 was to cause all sorts of problems because it stated that the bottom two clubs would have to retire from the league, but they would be eligible for re-election. And of course, when the first season was played and the bottom two clubs retired, they were re-elected by the other 8 senior clubs. And that caused an outcry in Yorkshire. And that anger that was building up and building up carried on way through to 1895. Now in Lancashire, the problem was that it was still promotion and relegation, but in Lancashire, the problem was professionalism. Clubs realised in Lancashire they could get to the very top of the game by promotion, and so they began to poach players from other clubs. And in that first season of 1892-93, many claims of professionalism. That clubs, not only were they paying broken time, and let's not make any bones about it here, Steve, most of the country was playing broken time at that time, not just the Lancashire and Yorkshire clubs. Welsh clubs were, the Midlands clubs were, clubs in the southwest of England were paying, they were all paying broken time. But in Lancashire, they were actually paying wages to players. And of course, that caused a problem because clubs realised we could get promotion if we get the right players. But equally, we can avoid relegation. 1894, that was when the problem started. 93, 94, the second season, we had Lee suspended for professionalism. We had Salford suspended for professionalism. And that angered the senior clubs who came out and said, we want a professional first division. And when Salford were found guilty and suspended, their secretary came out and dropped them the biggest bombshell of all. He said he intended to bring charges of professionalism against 5 other clubs: Swinton, Tyldesley, Rochdale Hornets, Broughton Rangers, and Wigan. So you'd got 7 of the first division clubs who were either suspended or were being investigated for professionalism. No mention of broken time payments, professionalism in Lancashire, in Yorkshire, promotion and relegation on merit. And matters came. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, so what did the fixture list look like for these clubs back then? Because I don't think there's a modern understanding of, did they regularly play teams from the south or not?
Yes, they did. They had if you look at the 10 Yorkshire clubs that then became 12 Yorkshire clubs, they played each other home and away. But interspersed with those were the matches with the southern clubs and the Midlands clubs and people from the southwest of England, and so the fixture list was full, and interspersed between sort of friendly games, for want of a better word, were these matches which were championship matches, first division matches, second division matches, third division matches, and so on. And that's how it evolved. I mean, prior to that, and no league fixtures and no league tables.
So this kind of revelation, how does it impact on our understanding of what rugby league is? I think we try to paint a picture of it as quite a noble pursuit and a social revolution, but it sounds like it was, very much commercial. And I guess if the denizens of Twickenham were levelling charges of crassness at these clubs and the northern clubs, that perhaps by Victorian definitions it was fair enough. It was crass commercialism.
Oh, without any doubt. Broken time had got nothing to do with this at all. It had got to do purely and simply with one thing, and that was the senior clubs in Yorkshire and then following them Lancashire wanted to control their own destiny. And they were not prepared to obey the rules of professionalism that were being drawn up by the authorities down in London. And this idea of a noble gesture to look after the financial welfare of their players, Steve, it was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. The senior clubs in Yorkshire were very, very good at smoke and mirrors. They went interested in the financial welfare of their players, but at the time they portrayed themselves as looking out for the welfare of the working class player in the north of England who could not afford to play the game unless they got financial support from the clubs. And what they were trying to do was to occupy the moral high ground, and also trying to get the rest of the Lancashire and Yorkshire counties on side, because when the split came and the lead up to the split, the whole of Yorkshire and the whole of Lancashire near clubs. And in an attempt to get them back on side, Joseph Platt came out with this now ingrained in our psyche that we split from the rugby union because they refused to sanction broken time payments to players. Nothing could have been further from the truth. But nobody wants to admit that, because don't forget, way back in '95, the whole of the country was against these 21 clubs, which became 22 clubs. And the best way to get them on side was to find some moral high ground that they could get to. And Joseph Platt hit the nail on the head, didn't he? Mm-hmm. It's because we're looking after our players. It stayed with us for 126 years. It's nothing more than the selfishness and greed of the clubs themselves. Mm. And has anything changed in the last 126 years?
No, exactly. I mean, that brings us down to the question of, that's a great quote. It brings us down to the question of what is rugby league, given that, for the first 12 years, it looked identical to rugby union, or more or less. I know they made incremental changes up to 1907 before they got rid of the breakaways, but you could only define rugby league as being really rugby run by rugby league administrators. It's the only defining factor of rugby league. I know now we've got to play, you could say, to play the ball or something like that, but we fiddle with the rules every year, still trying to make more money. And we saw just today the NRL shutting down their digital arm to keep their media partners happy, Channel 9 and News. It seems to be the only defining sort of factor of what rugby league is that sort of the commercial veracity, being voracious about money, and also that kind of that attitude of not wanting to toe the line, of being rebellious, of wanting to call the shots. They seem to be the things that really define what rugby league is.
Absolutely, nothing could be further from. And it's very. In '95, they were insular and inward-looking. They're still the same now. Don't forget, even by 1920, the only people who were allowed to vote in the rugby league in England on issues of any matter were those clubs who attended that meeting at the George Hotel on the 29th of August, 1895. Mm. And every decision that has been made over the years, and you're absolutely spot on, has been made purely and simply to how can we make the game more attractive to our sponsors, our benefactors, our coffers. And I mean, you see it now in Australian rugby league more so than in England. We get the likes of Peter V'landys saying, I'm listening to the fans. They're not listening to the fans, they're listening to Channel 9. They're listening to Fox Sport, aren't they? Mm-hmm. And that's, if you think about it, rugby union has changed very little in the last 126 years. If Daily Messenger came back today and watched a game of rugby league in Sydney or in England, what would he think? He would think it was another universe. The game has changed so dramatically over the last 126 years. It's not true. And as you say, we keep changing the game year on year. Why? The fans don't want it. The players don't want it. The referees don't want it. It can only be the broadcasters that want it.
And the fact that we're kind of destined, because it's in our DNA, to keep getting the shits with each other and to keep subdividing. And we had obviously, I don't think I'll ever get to 12 books, but I've got a second one coming out about 1997. And the fact that the only reason that was such a big deal was because someone financed a disgruntled group. That we have these disgruntled groups constantly. They're always there, and they're often waiting for a fairy godfather to come along and give them a bunch of money so they can go and do their own thing. We had the World Rugby League a few years ago, which obstructed rugby leagues getting recognised by GASF, by the Olympic Committee. And I bet any of the viewers can name a disgruntled rugby league group now who, if they could have a meeting at the George, or if they could have a media millionaire give them a bunch of money, they'd be off straight away, start their own competition. You know what I mean?
Without a shadow of a doubt. And the crazy thing is that, like in England, you've got Super League, and they're not interested in anyone else other than Super League. So the first division, the championship as it is now, and we've lost sight of the grassroots. Where do our players come from, Steve? They come from those amateur clubs whose mums and dads take their 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old kiddies to play the game, who go on and get them to play for a bigger club, who get them to attract the attention of a Super League club or a First Division club, and hopefully become a professional. All of that seems to have gone out of the window. Someone seems to think that you can buy players. We saw it, didn't we, in the 60s and 70s when the game in England was really down on its uppers. We brought in Australian coaches, we brought in Australian players, we changed the way in which we play. It was so successful, we haven't won a test series since 1970. And you're right. If someone came along tomorrow and said, I've got 10 million quid, I want to set up a rugby league, they would, all of the senior clubs in the Super League would say, what is in it for me? And they would jump ship without a moment's hesitation. And they just...
How would you sum up if rugby league was not born out of the broken time, pursuit of broken time for players who couldn't otherwise afford to play? In a sentence, how would you sum up how rugby league was born and why it was born? It sounds like it was born out of political rancor in Yorkshire and the pursuit of open professionalism in Lancashire. Is that how you'd sum it up?
Absolutely spot on, Steve. It was born out of 21, 22 senior clubs wanting to do exactly what they wanted to do, and to hell with the rest of the game in Lancashire, the rest of the game in Yorkshire. And in Lancashire, the driving force, I'm convinced, was professionalism. And in Yorkshire, the driving force was the fact that the clubs were not going to be dictated to by the rugby union authorities as to which clubs would be promoted and which would be relegated.
And given your new understanding of the game's birth, how does it impact your love of the game today?
Well, I have to say, Steve, if I'm being perfectly honest, my love of the game has diminished quite considerably. The game that I grew up watching I was born in Wigan and I was a big Wigan fan, and Wigan had a great deal of success. But when the green and golds turned up, you would guarantee that there would be an almighty crowd, an almighty game, and everybody would be happy. Those days have gone. What I see now is a commercial game, which is, in England, and I'm here in Australia, 5 kicks and five drives, 5 charges and a kick. If I could bring in one rule, it would be you cannot score a try unless you carry the ball over the line. You have to run with the ball to score a try. How many times do we see people kick into the corners, catch the ball over the line and fall over? I despair as to where this game is going, because we're pandering to broadcasters and not looking after the history of the game and the supporters that grew up like you and I. I'm 74, but there are people coming into the game who've been watching the game for perhaps 10, 15 years, or in the early 30s. What's going to happen when they lose faith in this game of ours?
Tom, before we wind up, I don't want to keep you too long, but can you tell us a bit about the process of when you write your books? Can you tell us about how you allocate your time? Obviously, I see them on Amazon. Are they, do you use a self-publishing platform? And then also at the end, when you tell me that stuff, if you could tell everyone where they can get Rugby League is Born, which I think everyone who's watched to this point, who's interested enough in the subject, will probably want to read it.
Yeah, my starting point is always something. Well, I suppose if I'm being honest, I want to bring back into the public domain stuff from 100 years ago, because in England, when a player retires, we tend to forget about them very quickly. And, there's a lot of history that's been lost. And so my starting point has always been to try and bring back into the public domain a little piece of history like the 1920 test, the Rorke's Drift test, the tours that went on between the wars and so on. And so the problem is trying to write books, you're writing for a niche market. And when you write for a niche market, selling it is difficult. Trying to get a publisher is difficult. And I find that Amazon and Kindle self-publishing it's been a boon for me really, because I write a book. My wife and I sit down and she proofreads with me, and we then publish it. It's published within sort of half a day, and people can then go on to Amazon or go into any good bookshop and say, I'd like this copy. I'd like a copy of the Rugby League is Born After a Long Labour, and they can read. They may not agree with what I think, Steve. They may think that my interpretation of what happened in that meeting in 1895 is completely rubbish. But at least they're making them sit back and think, oh, that's a new slant on things. So people who are interested in rugby league and rugby league history, go to Amazon, go to your bookshop, buy it. It's by Tom Mather, and I don't make a lot of money, but I do get it back into the public domain, Steve.
It's been awesome to speak to you, and if I can add that I did add your book on my store, shop.stevemascord.com, just the other day, and it doesn't impact a cent that you get, but the links mean that I might get
I'm just grateful.
About a cent. Yeah.
But I'm just grateful for the fact that we're talking here, and you are helping to get rugby league fans in England and in Australia aware of things which they may not be aware of.
It is, and I think it's fascinating too. But I don't know if a lot of fans do. I imagine only a tiny percentage of people do think about it. But to me, the origins of the sport speak to the way I read current events and to the way I allocate my time, and to why I would go to the grand final this weekend, or why I might buy a book or buy a jersey or whatever. An understanding of a sport's history to me is essential to what it stands for. And I think a lot of people, particularly in this country, in the UK, do buy into the myth of rugby league's birth, and that it was a noble social upheaval and a social movement, when in fact it was just a breakaway competition or two breakaway competitions, and it just happened to come along at a time with the development of mass media and all that sort of stuff, and deindustrialization. It came along at a time where that meeting was more important than it might otherwise have been. We had a meeting a couple of weeks ago where I think the Huddersfield referees refused to referee anymore in local junior competition. And at the time, when there was no TV, there's no Super League, there's no NRL, there's no games on radio, a little meeting like that is actually seismic. And that's what this was. It was a kind of it was something now we might consider a minor meeting, because no one was getting paid any money, or if they were, it was under the counter. The 22 clubs involved, and I guess in the whole country at that time there might have been 400 clubs. But because of all the other things happening in society at the time, it had this cascade effect, and we now look upon it as we would look upon Moses, parting the Red Sea, just because of all these other things,
Just think about this. This wonderful meeting, this cataclysm, suggests that the Northern Union was formed a week earlier. Now, at 6:30 on that Thursday evening, 21 rugby club representatives sat down. The first thing they did was formally accept they were setting up a Northern Union. Then they decided to send their letters of resignation into the Rugby Union. Then they decided, we're going to meet next Tuesday to sort out a fixture list. By 7:30, they were sitting down having dinner. It wasn't that big a meeting at all, was it? And it's really funny. And the other interesting thing is, they say history is bunk, but history, if we forget history, we'll make the same mistakes again. And how many mistakes has the rugby league made in 126 years? By simply not looking at the history of the game.
Mm-hmm.
It's a crazy system. It's like something out of Monty Python.
It is. And again, we saw today with the dismantling of the NRL Digital, which was a hugely profit-making thing and was a bit of a nuclear bunker against the collapse of traditional media rights, which are collapsing because people don't watch traditional media anymore. They don't watch the content that way anymore. And so the NRL had built itself a bunker against that development, seeing it on the horizon, and just blew up the bunker this morning. So that is just another example. And I think the game is it's in an interminable loop of making these mistakes because of the way it was born. It was born that way. It was born out of rebellion and rancor and anger and hate and rivalry. That's actually where it comes from. And it's just, I think, doomed to repeat that forever. That is in the very nature. And to expect rugby league to be any different is to expect communism to open a chain of McDonald's restaurants or expect God to be an atheist. I just think it's against the very nature of the sport to expect any more of it. But anyway, I think on that note, thank you very much for your time.
Talking to you. Greatly appreciated it.
Thank you.